I watched him wipe the plate clean, and I smiled back, because the poison was already working. I still remember that rainy Friday night as if it happened yesterday, even though it's been more than 60 years. The wind rattled the windows of Mabel's spoon, and the scent of simmering gravy curled through the air like a whisper. I was standing at my old oak counter, the one scarred by generations of rolling pins and pie crusts, when I felt that familiar knot tighten in my chest, because I knew he was coming. Frank Bellows, with that crooked smile and sharp eyes, was on his way for his usual meatloaf and extra gravy, and I could almost hear the drip of rainwater from his boots as he settled into the corner booth. Before I dive into the rest of the story, I've got a small favor. If you're new here, hit that like button, and if you've ever wondered how far a mother will go for justice, drop me a comment and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. My name is Mabel Carter, and I've spent my whole 82 years in Cedar Hill, Arkansas, a place so small that everyone knows your grandmother's middle name. My mother opened this diner back in 1939, slinging homemade pies and a gravy recipe she guarded like a state secret. Over the decades, the walls filled with photos, sheriffs in starched uniforms, crop-dusted farmers, the old mayor tipping his hat after some long-forgotten celebration. Folks came for the comfort food, but stayed for the warmth that dripped as thick as the gravy on their plates. To them, I was just the sweet old lady in the apron. But beneath my apron, I carried something far heavier than a skillet. Rosie, my sweet, quiet girl, was only 16 when her world shattered. She walked home from school one evening, humming under her breath, and never reached the front porch. 3 days later, we found her in the woods, broken and silenced by a cruelty that could have been born only from a monster's heart. She survived, but she never spoke again, and 5 years later, she chose to leave this earth on her own terms. The police shrugged it off. Rosie's tragedy was unfortunate, they said, and nobody paid for it. Except me. Every afternoon, Frank Bellows swaggered into my diner like he owned the place. He'd order that meatloaf, smirk at me over his glass of sweet tea, and I'd pretend not to feel the ice in my veins. He was the sheriff's son, untouchable, unaccountable, untamed. But that night, when the sky was ink black and the rain slashed against the windows, I slipped up to the shelf where my grandmother's old arsenic had sat since the 20s. It was labeled rat poison, but I knew better than to trust labels. I measured just enough to bring an end, wrapped it in my secret gravy recipe, and watched him take that first bite. He left the diner smiling, and by dawn, they called it a heart attack. No one suspected a thing, because I never left a clue, only a whisper of chili flakes and rosemary in the air. I kept my head down, served pies, and wiped tables like nothing had changed. Pride was my shield, and silence my verdict. I didn't fear prison. I feared the idea that justice would never have been served if I didn't do it myself. Now, at 82, I sit in this same booth where Frank once stared at me with challenge in his eyes. I've lived long enough to know that some people don't deserve a trial. Some people deserve gravy. My son, Tommy, thinks his sister slipped away from depression. He never knew the truth. My grandkids still come in for hot biscuits and chocolate pie, clueless that their grandmother once fed poison to a man who thought he was above the law. So here I am, telling you my story, not with tears of regret, but with a single tear of release, because I slept like a baby the night he died. God'll sort out my soul when the time comes. But if you ask me, I did what any mother would do when the world turned its back on her child. Stick around. There's more to this tale than a pot of gravy and a broken heart. And tell me, if justice can't be found in a courtroom, would you take it into your own hands? I was born with flour on my hands, or at least that's how it felt. Cedar Hill wasn't much to look at. A single red brick main street, dusty roads that shimmered golden in the afternoon sun, and a scattering of clapboard houses where everyone's front porch was as familiar as their next-door neighbors. My mother, Mabel Carter, opened Mabel's Spoon in 1939, right after Dad left to fight in the war. I was just 5 years old, but I can still taste those first cinnamon rolls scattered warm across the counter and hear her humming as she kneaded dough. From the moment I could reach a stool, I was her apprentice, stirring jams, rolling crusts, learning every crease and fold of a perfect pie. By the time I was 16, I practically ran the kitchen myself, and the town came to know me as Little Mabel, the girl who could flip flapjacks with her eyes shut and ladle gravy as smooth as silk. Working in that diner was more than a job, it was my world. The morning came with the hiss of the coffee pot and the soft chatter of farmers trading gossip over eggs and bacon. By midday, school kids in Letterman jackets would crowd the counter for grilled cheese and French fries, their laughter echoing off the walls plastered with old sheriff badges and vintage tractor posters. In the afternoons, the farmers drifted in for meatloaf and sweet tea, leaning into the booth to talk crops, weather, and who'd won the county fair that year. Evenings slowed, but the kitchen lights stayed on late for potluck suppers and the occasional wandering stranger looking for a home-cooked meal. I've spent over 60 years behind that counter, longer than most of these tables have been here, and in that time, I learned not just how to cook, but how to listen. I'd like to think I'm a patient woman. I've never been one for raising my voice, unless it's to call "order up" when the timer dings. Folks say I have quiet strength, and they're right. When a pot boils over or an engine sputters down the street, I stay calm, measuring each move with the precision I learned rolling dough by hand. I'm stubborn too, hard-headed like my mama was. If I believe in something, I'll see it through, even if I have to stand alone. That stubbornness was a gift on slow days, when rain washed out harvests and the diner sat half empty. I kept that sign swinging, I baked those pies, and I prided myself on giving every visitor a bit of comfort, no matter how small. Looking back, I see that this place shaped me as much as I shaped it. The rhythm of those early mornings and late nights, the familiar faces circling in for comfort food and friendly smiles, it all anchored me. It taught me that cooking isn't just about ingredients, but about people, their stories, their fears, their joy. And it taught me that sometimes the simplest gesture, a warm biscuit, a slow-simmered gravy, can carry more love and loyalty than anything else in the world. That's the woman I became at 82, a keeper of memories, a guardian of tradition, and a cook who believed in the power of a good meal to heal, until the night I realized that some wounds run too deep for gravy alone. It was a Friday evening in late October, and the sky had that heavy, charcoal gray look that tells you rain is coming. One of those nights when the air smells like earth and secrets. I was standing at the pass-through window between the kitchen and the dining room, wiping my hands on my apron and watching the regulars drift in. There was Earl Thompson, the tobacco farmer with a gentle drawl, settling into the booth by the window. Mary Lou Garrett, who ran the beauty shop on Main Street, sliding onto a stool for her usual slice of pecan pie. And then there was Tommy, my son, leaning against the corner table, cracking a joke to make me laugh because he always worried I was working too hard. I poured coffee into chipped white mugs, listening to the hum of conversation, the clink of silverware, the soft chatter about crops and church suppers, the occasional bark of the old jukebox at the back, playing an old George Jones tune. Everything felt ordinary, warm, familiar, until the bell over the door jingled one more time, and in walked Frank Bellows. He was dripping from the rain, water beading on his leather jacket and rolling down the brim of that crooked hat he liked to wear. He smiled at me, that practiced, lopsided grin that chilled my bones every single time. "Evening, Mabel," he said, voice smooth as syrup. "Meatloaf special, extra gravy." I nodded and felt that old knot tighten in my chest. You could feel the tension the moment he walked in, like thunder rumbling beneath the surface of a calm lake. The other customers quieted for a moment, watching him slide into that corner booth as if they were waiting for a storm to break. I forced a smile and told them I'd be right back with their desserts. On nights like that, I always had a helper in the kitchen, my granddaughter Lila, who'd been learning the ropes since she was 10. She was at my side now, sliding a tray of biscuits onto the rack. She glanced up at me, confusion in her young eyes. "Grandma, is he okay?" she whispered. I gave her a reassuring nod, but my voice came out tight. "Just finish those biscuits, sugar. I'll handle this." I still get goosebumps thinking about it, how she looked at me, trusting, innocent, and how I had to pretend everything was fine. Back in the dining room, Frank tapped his spoon against the plate, waiting. I could see the faint tremor in his hand, though whether it was cold or nerves I couldn't tell. I ladled the gravy onto his meatloaf, that warm, thick ribbon hiding whatever I'd stirred into it. He caught my eye for a second, that look like he knew I knew, that challenge hanging between us. Man, it was crazy how a single glance could carry a lifetime of pain. I walked away, heart pounding, and pretended to fuss with dishes, listening to his spoon clatter against the plate, to his throat clearing when he swallowed his first bite. Around me, the other diners launched back into their own conversations, unaware of the storm about to break. Earl asked Mary Lou to pass the sugar. Tommy teased Lila about her new school uniform. The jukebox crooned on. But I could only hear the tick of the old wall clock counting down, second by second, until he'd walked out of my life for good. Or so I believed. That was the trigger, right there, the moment I realized I had the power to change a story that justice had left unfinished. And as I stood in the kitchen watching steam curl from the pots, I remembered Rosie, my sweet girl, her bright laugh silenced by his cruelty, her future stolen in a single act of violence. I'll never forget that day, that look on Frank's face, and the choice I made behind these walls while the world kept spinning outside. So lean in close, because the next part of this tale is where it all really begins, and you deserve to know every detail. It started the moment I realized Frank hadn't died right away. I watched from the kitchen window as he left, shoulders hunched against the rain, carrying that plate of meatloaf, and I thought, thank God it worked. But hours later, when the phone rang and they told me he'd been rushed to the hospital instead of dying at home as I'd expected, my heart slammed against my ribs. Something in me snapped. I'd planned for a quiet exit, a sudden heart attack, no questions asked. But now I faced the first crack in my careful design. The doctor on the line didn't sound convinced it was just cardiac failure. He'd found traces of arsenic and wanted answers. I felt my skin prickle, as if the walls themselves were closing in. That night, the diner sat dark and empty, except for the buzzing fluorescent light in the kitchen. I paced between the counter and the fryer, counting the seconds on the clock over and over, listening for sirens that never came. My granddaughter Lila was at home, sleeping soundly, unaware that her grandmother's decades-long secret was unraveling. My son, Tommy, was probably halfway through his shift at the garage, oblivious to the fact that his mother might soon be facing the police. The thought of him finding out, of seeing that look of betrayal in his eyes, made my chest tighten. I'd taken every precaution. The arsenic jar hidden behind dusty cans of beans, the single dose measured with shaking hands, the gravy that masked the taste. But reality had its own designs, and now I was caught in its pull. The next morning, when I unlocked the diner, I found a detective's badge tucked under the door. A stiff-backed man in a rumpled suit introduced himself to Tommy, who was helping me bring out chairs. "Mrs. Carter, I need to ask you a few questions about Mr. Bellows' condition," he said, and I felt as though the floor had given way beneath me. My voice came out steady, too steady, when I replied, "Of course, officer, have a seat." But inside, panic had bloomed like a weed. What if Tommy got dragged into this? What if Lila discovered my secret and lost faith in me forever? That afternoon, the detective circled me as I cooked lunch, his eyes flicking to the gravy ladle, to my trembling hands. He asked about the arsenic, about my grandmother's old recipes, about whether I'd stored anything dangerous in the back. Every answer I gave felt like a trapdoor under my feet. I watched him scribble notes, felt the weight of judgment in each scratch of his pen. And then came the question I dreaded most. Why would someone want to poison Frank Bellows? I forced a breath into words I never rehearsed. I don't know. He's family of the sheriff. Maybe someone who held a grudge. The lie tasted bitter, and in that moment, I almost believed it myself. By the time the detective left, promising to return with test results, I stood alone in the hush of the empty diner. The fryer's oil bubbled quietly, the coffee machine dripped its final drop, and the walls, lined with photos of happier times, seemed to close in. I realized the choice I'd made to protect my daughter's memory had unleashed a new nightmare. Now, every steaming pot of gravy, every pie cooling on the sill, became evidence. The diner that once felt like home had turned into a courtroom where I stood accused. And somewhere in the rain-drenched shadows of Cedar Hill, I knew the real verdict was still out there, waiting to be delivered. I felt my hands go ice cold when the bell over the door jingled again, only this time, it wasn't a customer. Detective Harris stepped into the diner just as the lunch rush ended, his trench coat dripping onto the floor and his eyes fixed on me like a hawk scouting prey. My heart thundered so loud I thought everyone in town might hear it. I was standing behind the counter, ladle in hand, the gravy pot steaming between us like a silent judge. He didn't waste a second. "Mrs. Carter," he said, voice low but urgent. "We've got Mr. Bellows in critical condition. The levels of arsenic are through the roof. You need to come with me." The words hit me like a hammer to the chest. I clutched the counter edge to keep from swaying. My mind raced. Escape through the kitchen door? Send Lila away? Protect Tommy? But there was nowhere to run. This moment was my reckoning. Tommy appeared then, wiping his hands on a rag, concern creasing his brow as he took in the detective's badge. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, voice tight. The diner felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in around us. I opened my mouth to lie, but the lie stuck in my throat. Detective Harris didn't wait. "Your son's going to have to step aside," he said, pointing at the door. "Mrs. Carter, you're not under arrest yet, but we need to ask you more questions, and I need you to come downtown." His tone carried no promise of safety, only inevitability. My world slowed. I stared at the ladle dripping gravy onto a waiting plate and remembered Rosie's pale face, her silence like a shroud. I felt every year of silence and pride converge in that single heartbeat. I had promised myself I'd never break, not for police, nor for sons or granddaughters. But as Tommy reached for my arm, worry etched into his face. Something in me cracked. I can't go," I stammered, voice trembling. "Not like this." The detective cocked an eyebrow, pen hovering over his notebook. "Why not?" Tears welled up before I could stop them. "Because," I swallowed, "because I did what I had to do." The silence that followed was so thick I could taste it. Tommy's eyes widened, and Detective Harris leaned forward, pen poised. "Mrs. Carter, that sounds like a confession," he said quietly. In that moment, the diner felt full of ghosts. Rosie's laughter before it died, the jukebox music that once brought comfort, the countless hands I'd held steady as they whispered their own pains. I took a breath deeper than I've ever drawn and laid the ladle on the counter. "Yes," I whispered, voice breaking free. "I did it. 60 years ago, I poisoned Frank Bellows with the one thing he thought he'd never suspect. My gravy." Tommy gasped. Lila appeared at the doorway, drawn by the tension, her young face pale. Detective Harris's pen scratched across the page, and the diner lights felt too bright. I stood there, shaky but resolute, and watched as the man who once terrorized my daughter's life finally became the subject of justice, slow, painful, and long overdue. My pulse settled as I spoke the words that had lived in me for decades. I'd held that secret like a stone in my chest, and now it was such a relief to let it drop. The detective closed his notebook, eyes softening in a way I never expected. "You'll have your day in court," he said. I nodded, and in that charged silence, I felt Rosie beside me, her silent presence stronger than any courtroom witness. This was my climax, the moment I traded 60 years of quiet pride for a truth so heavy it could sink me. But for the first time since her death, I felt lighter than air. I glanced at Tommy, whose lips quivered with a mix of hurt and pride. I caught Lila's eye, and she nodded, tears in her young gaze. And then I faced the detective and whispered, "Let's be on our way." I will never forget how it all settled, how the long shadow of that night finally lifted, if only just a little. After my confession, the county attorney moved with surprising swiftness. They knew I was 82, that I'd held on to this secret for 6 decades, and they were almost as tired of the silence as I was. At my hearing, the courtroom was packed, reporters in the back, curious townspeople filling every bench, and then there was Tommy, my son, sitting beside Lila, my granddaughter, her hand gripping his. I watched them both as the prosecutor laid out the facts: the old jar of arsenic hidden behind cans of beans, the lab reports showing lethal doses in Frank's system, my own words echoing through the transcripts. I felt no shame. I felt pride that I had stood up for my daughter when the law would not. The judge listened, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. When he spoke, his voice was neither cold nor kind, just matter of fact. He acknowledged the years I'd lived quietly, the pain that drove me, and the absence of any prior criminal record. He noted the failure of the justice system to protect Rosie and the community's complicity in turning a blind eye to Frank's cruelty. He sentenced me to 2 years of supervised probation, no jail time, not because I was above the law, but because the law recognized the unique cruelty that had gone unanswered for so long. "Mabel Carter," he said, "you will answer for your actions, but you need not pay with your life." The courtroom exhaled. Tommy brushed a tear from Lila's cheek. I stood and quietly told the judge, "Thank you, Your Honor," with more grace than I'd shown most days in the kitchen. Outside, cameras flashed as I walked down the steps. A frail old woman wearing justice as her only coat. I felt lighter than air. The weight of 60 years of silence, of every whisper in that diner, every look from Frank, dissolved in that moment. Back in Cedar Hill, the news spread faster than a skillet fire. Some neighbors clucked their tongues. How could a grandmother do such a thing? Others nodded, remembering Rosie's hollow eyes and the polite hush that fell whenever Frank swaggered by. The local paper ran a front-page story: "Mother of victim takes justice into her own hands." Some letters came emailing and hand-scrawled, "I understand. You did what no court would," and a few that said, "Shame on you." Yet the regulars at Mabel's Spoon showed up as always: Earl Thompson tipping his hat, Mary Lou Garrett squeezing my hand, and even the sheriff in his starched uniform, looking me in the eye with something like respect. Tommy and Lila stood beside me behind the counter that very next morning. The diner was quieter, almost reverent, as if the tables themselves were reflecting on what had passed. I ladled coffee and biscuits as steam curled in the morning light. Lila whispered, "Grandma, are you okay?" I looked at her, the same brave girl who had trusted me all those years, and my heart swelled. "I am," I said, "because the story is finally mine to tell." Tommy nodded, pride and relief softening his face. "We've got your back," he said. Life in Cedar Hill moved on. Fields were plowed, church socials were held, and the jukebox still played old George Jones songs in the corner. Mabel's Spoon continued to serve pies and gravy, though I admit I leave out the extra for old time's sake. People eat here for the comfort of home, but now they also come for the story of a mother who would do anything to protect her child, even when the world would not. For me, resolution meant more than a legal verdict. It meant peace, an end to the lurking dread that justice was forever out of reach. I came to understand that some wounds can only be healed by truth, regardless of how painful. And though I remain haunted by Rosie's silence, I know her memory now rests in a place of dignity no trial could ever grant her. I walk these floors each morning with pride, knowing that I have nothing more to conceal. The past found its reckoning, and in its fallout, I found freedom. And that, my friends, is how the story ends, for now. I won't lie, those first mornings after the court hearing were strange. I'd wake before dawn, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the coffee maker, and I'd find myself holding that ladle, staring down into the empty pot of gravy as though waiting for something more. For so long, I'd measured out every ounce of myself in teaspoons, guarding a secret that shaded every smile, every greeting, every slice of pie. When the secret finally came out, I felt a hollowness, as though I'd poured out the worst part of me and was left to reckon with what remained. Some days, I'd catch my reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator door and barely recognize the woman staring back. Her shoulders a little straighter, her eyes a little softer, but also edged with something I couldn't name, a residue of all I'd carried for 60 years. The town watched me, and in a way, I watched myself through their eyes. I saw whispers in grocery aisles, felt the weight of curious stares when I stepped into the post office, but I also felt unexpected kindness. A nod from Mrs. Jenkins at the beauty shop, who quietly said, "I admire your courage," and a simple wave from the sheriff, who once might have turned away at my front door. My son Tommy began to help more in the diner, as if he wanted to rebuild something that had cracked between us. We didn't talk much about that night or the trial, but sometimes he'd catch my hand when I passed him a plate, and that small touch spoke more than words. Inside me, I felt both lighter and unsettled. Lighter because I no longer carried the burden of unspoken justice. Unsettled because I wasn't used to living without a secret to protect me. Cooking felt different too, a little scarier but also more honest. When I stirred the gravy now, I thought of Rosie less as the spark that drove me, and more as the heart I wanted to honor with every meal I made. Each biscuit I pulled from the oven carried a silent promise. No more hiding, no more silences. At night, I sometimes dream of Frank Bellows' smile, like a stubborn ghost refusing to stay buried. I wake up and remind myself that some stories don't end neatly, but I've done what I could to give my daughter's memory a voice. And in that voice, I've found a new purpose, a determination to live the years I have left with honesty and warmth. The gravy tastes a bit sweeter now, as though it knows that true comfort can only come from a heart at peace. I've learned that justice doesn't always wear a badge or live behind courthouse doors. It can be quiet, it can be patient, and sometimes it arrives decades late. Holding on to my secret taught me that silence can feel like strength until it becomes a prison. True courage, I've discovered, is the willingness to face your own truth, no matter how dark, and let it free the parts of you that have been weighed down by guilt or grief. I used to believe that protecting a secret was the highest form of loyalty, but now I know that loyalty can also mean sharing your burden so others can help carry it. I've also realized that love takes many shapes. For Rosie, love meant a mother's fierce protection, so fierce that it blurred the lines between right and wrong. For Tommy and Lila, love means standing by me even when they don't understand every detail. And for myself, love means accepting the imperfect choices I made in a broken system. Cooking taught me that simple ingredients, flour, sugar, salt, thyme, can combine to create comfort and healing. In life, the simplest truths, honesty, compassion, forgiveness, can do the same. Most of all, I've learned that every story has its own timing. Mine took 60 years to be told, and while I wish I'd found my voice sooner, I'm grateful that I found it at all. If you're carrying a secret, a regret, or an unspoken truth, know this: it's never too late to speak up, to seek peace, and to reclaim the warmth you once lost. That's the real recipe for a life well lived. After the trial, word of what happened in Cedar Hill spread faster than a skillet fire, and before long I was fielding invitations to speak at local culinary gatherings and women's circles. Chefs from neighboring towns would slip into Mabel's spoon under the guise of wanting a taste of my gravy, but really they were there to hear the story from my own lips. Some called it a legend, the chef who served justice with her secret sauce. It felt strange at first, wearing that reputation like an apron I'd never asked for, but I soon realized that my experience had given me a platform to talk about things most kitchens ignore: the power dynamics that play out behind counters, the importance of standing up when the system fails, and the vulnerability of trusting someone else with your life or your livelihood. My approach to cooking shifted too. I began hosting monthly story suppers, where I'd invite guests, farmers, teachers, fellow cooks, to share a personal chapter over a simple meal. We'd gather around the big oak table, pass a pot of stew seasoned with whatever the season offered, and speak honestly about fear, grief, and the small acts of courage that keep us going. In those evenings, I saw how food can do more than fill an empty stomach. It can open hearts and bridge gaps that words alone cannot cross. Within Cedar Hill, the atmosphere at the diner changed subtly. Regulars who once came for comfort food now came for community, often lingering long after their plates were empty, talking and laughing in a way that felt like healing. Younger cooks sought me out for advice, not only on perfecting a roux, but on maintaining integrity in a profession that sometimes demands compromise. I'd give them a steady look, ladle in hand, and say, "Remember that every dish you serve carries a piece of your story. Make sure it's one you're proud to tell." I never encountered another Frank Bellows, thank God, but I did see how fear and silence can allow wrongdoing to fester. My story taught me, and those around me, that sometimes the greatest recipe for change is simply speaking your truth, one honest sentence at a time. And though I've returned to my rhythms, morning coffee, pie tins, gravy ladles, I carry a renewed sense of purpose in every dish, knowing that my kitchen will always be a place where stories are shared, wounds begin to close, and justice, however late, can finally be served. Here we are, at the end of a story that began with gravy and ended in a courtroom, and I hope you're still with me. Because sometimes the questions we ask ourselves are more important than the answers we find. I spent 60 years carrying a secret so heavy it shaped every step I took, and it took taking justice into my own hands to finally uncover a piece I didn't know I was missing. Now, as I ladle out biscuits and pour coffee for the folks who come through these doors, I see that real courage isn't measured in headlines or verdicts, but in the small choices we make every day. To speak up when we're afraid, to offer kindness when it's easier to walk away, to trust that our worst mistakes don't have to define us. My kitchen has always been a place of warmth and welcome, but now it's also a reminder that sometimes the sweetest comfort comes from facing the hardest truths. So I'll leave you with this. If you knew the system had failed someone you love, and the only way to set things right was by stepping outside the law, would you do it?